In this lesson, we'll learn how to manage the world space and face resolution within our Mari projects. Okay, so in the last lesson we created this particular project with several pieces of geometry, actually several different OBJ files. And if you remember, we actually used a world space texel density, and we set that texel density to 16 texels per centimeter. Now, if we jump up here to the toolbars, you'll notice that we have a Ptex toolbar. If you don't see that one up there, you might just right-click on your toolbars and make sure that you do have the Ptex toolbar turned on here. Now, there's several options here in the Ptex toolbar that you should probably familiarize yourself with. Now, some of these may look familiar. You see here that we have the texel density, and it's set to the density that we actually set all of our objects to when we created this project. It's set to 16. So let's just go ahead and zoom in here, and I'll tell you what, let me go ahead and open up my objects palette. And let me go ahead and open up my selection groups palette here as well. So I'm going to come over here and let's maybe just kind of focus in on her head. All right, great. So I'm going to go ahead and select her hood here. And if I hold down the S key on my keyboard, you can see that I do have it selected. And remember, this is set to 16 texels per centimeter, and that was for every object that we created. Now we can come in here and manually change that using the Ptex toolbar. If we maybe selected that object and came in and adjusted that, maybe we wanted to change that to a value of 10 texels per centimeter. We could change that here, but that's not actually going to take effect until we hit this little sphere, globe-looking button right here to the left of that. And you can see here that if I click that, Mari may actually pause just for a moment as that's recalculated. In my case, it did not. There wasn't a big enough change, but we've actually recalculated the texel density for that object based on 10 texels per centimeter. Now, I'm going to go ahead and adjust that back up here because really this isn't going to make much sense unless you see some paint on our object. So let me go ahead and switch over to our hood object here, and I'll just grab a brush. Let's go ahead and grab a basic brush, and I'll just grab a hard 100 here. And we'll just paint right here on the top of her head, and I'll go ahead and choose just a nice bright red color so we can see it. Alright, so we'll go ahead and make sure we have that selected, and if I come in here and begin to paint this, wow, that's really bright. Let me make that a little darker. There we go. Alright, we'll just paint in kind of a spot here with some straight edges, with some curved ones. And let's see here, we'll go ahead and just bake that down. All right, great. Now, if I turn on my wireframe, we can see all the polygons here. And as a matter of fact, we just turn that off so we can zoom in here. And if I start to zoom in here, you're going to eventually see we've got sort of some jagged edges around here. Now, this is a resolution-based thing. And, you know, as a matter of fact, if you've worked in a program like Photoshop and you've worked with pixels, you know that this is often referred to as the jaggies, or basically, this is an issue where the resolution is not high enough for basically the magnification that we're viewing this area at. Well, if we wanted to increase the resolution of this area, we could do that a couple of ways. We could try and do that based on the world space texel density, which may or may not work. It may be a little difficult. Remember, we explained in the last lesson what that means and how that's calculated. So if I were to make sure I have this object selected and come in here and let's just say double this to something like 32 texels, we'll hit that button there so that gets recalculated. And let's just paint a little bit more here. You can see here that if I bake that down, we actually fix the problem to a degree. You can see here that we're not quite as jagged as we are like right here. If we come over here, the jagged edges is a higher resolution. You can see here that there's more texels at work in this area. Now, if I were to just bump that back down here, We'll go ahead and go back down to what we started at, that's 16 texels. There's actually another way that we can do that without having to recalculate the texel density for, say, the whole object. So we can actually adjust the face resolution for just selected faces here. So as soon as this finishes recalculating based on that 16 texel density value, we'll grab our selection tool. There we go, and you can see that it pops it right back to that jagged edge that we looked at before. So we can actually come in and maybe we want to just use our selection tool in face mode to select maybe these faces right here. There we go. So we can calculate our resolution based on the world space texel density, like we've already spoken about, and we can also calculate it based on face resolution. Now, when I say face resolution, I mean that each one of these polygons that we have selected here, each one of these faces, has a resolution. And by default, this resolution, if you're working with a mesh that's all quads, is going to be 1 texel per face. Now, if you're working with a triangulated mesh, then it's going to be 2 texels per face, but that value is actually controlled right up here, again in the Ptex toolbar. You can see here that it's set to a size of 1. So this can actually be controlled by default through Mari's preferences. If we jump over here to Edit and Preferences, you can come over here to the Ptex tab, and you can see that we have a minimum size under face textures right here. So we can change that and increase that all the way up to 32 texels per face. Now, that's going to be 32 texels per face for every Ptex project that we create from here on out if we go ahead and set it to that. Now, I would recommend leaving it at that because more than likely you're not going to need that kind of resolution for every single face that you paint. It's a much better workflow to actually manually increase the size of faces in an area where maybe you are starting to paint it and you're seeing that there's not enough resolution. And for example, this area right here. So if I hold down the S key, and again we preview the faces that I have selected, I could come over here and drop this down, and we can actually increase the face resolution for those selected faces all the way up to 8K. You can see here 8K in terms of texels per face. Now that's 8K per face, so you want to be very careful with how you increase the face resolution because this will dramatically increase the size of your texture files that you are eventually going to export out of Mari. So keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and bump this up to something like maybe 256. And again, we're going to have to press this little button right here that looks like 4 arrows pointing at the corners. And if we press that, Mari's going to think about that for a moment, and visibly really nothing happened, except for maybe a little bit of artifacting there. And that's actually a result of the preview here by my graphics card. So nothing to be alarmed, that isn't actually there. You can kind of see sort of a red outline around the faces themselves. But let's come in here now, and let's paint in that area that we actually had increase the face resolution size. So we'll just go ahead and shrink my brush down a little, and now when I paint in there, you can see that we get a much cleaner line because we've raised that up, and now instead of 1 texel at work on each face, we have 256 of those texels working to our advantage. So I can bake that down, and now when we start to zoom in on that, we can't see any kind of resolution at all. And we've only increased the resolution for these faces right here. We haven't increased it for the entire object like we were when we were increasing the world space texel density. So those are a couple ways that we can manage the resolution of our object, whether it's world space resolution or whether it's face resolution, using this Ptex toolbar. Now, there are a couple of other buttons on here. You can see here over to the left we have these 2 buttons. So this button on the left is simply going to double the face resolution for selected faces, and this one to the right of that will simply cut that resolution in half. So a couple buttons that you can quickly double or half the resolution for selected faces. Over here we have a fill selected faces with foreground color or fill selected faces with background color. Those are really great buttons to have. I love using those. It's much quicker than jumping up to maybe the patches menu and going to fill foreground or fill background. I love having the buttons up there for those. So I tell you what, in the next lesson, let's go ahead and begin talking about painting our textures in Ptex with Mari.